On Tuesday, May 14th, 2019, we met Gerald and Patricia Carr. Jerry was a Marine Corps fighter pilot and then a NASA astronaut. He visited Germany and Hungary during the Cold War. Pat did a series of paintings called The Continuum. Together, they traveled to Berlin a year after the collapse of the wall. They talked to us about their experiences during the Cold War.
The Cold War to me means a case where at the end of the Second World War, we were still not trusting each other. The Russians, the Americans, the British, and the French were not trusting each other, particularly the Russians. And so we began to partition ourselves off from one another. And the beginning of it had to do with the partitioning of Germany after the defeat of Germany, and it's kind of like the spoil system after a war. You know, everybody got a piece of Germany. What they were going to do with it was what nobody knew. So that's basically the Cold War for me. It's a situation where people didn't trust each other, and so they kind of split each other up, split things up, and stayed away from each other.
Well, the Cold War lasted several decades, from the 40s through the 90s. And so in the 40s, I was not much older than you. I was in high school, 15 years old, when 16 when the war ended. I went to college a couple of years and got married and started raising a family. And the Cold War was something I barely heard of. It was way across the ocean. So I would say it would be the late Cold War that I had a growing awareness of. I became more aware of war at that point in time. I had a friend who asked what was my opinion of the Vietnam War, and I said, I don't really have an opinion. I realized I'm making myself sound pretty stupid here. And he said, well, you can't not have an opinion. You have to get an opinion. So that was the beginning of what I call my social awareness. And interestingly, I became quite a feminist, a social activist from that point on.
I remember lots of talk about nuclear weapons, and because that whole nuclear warfare thing was very new to everybody, and everybody was very, very much anxious about nuclear weapons. That was brought up quite frequently. I think I, as a young boy, was more interested in the Berlin airlift. That was really interesting to me because I wanted to fly. And the fact that we were keeping all of those people alive in West Berlin by flying supplies into them, I thought was pretty remarkable.
I do remember people talking particularly about Berlin's isolation within the Eastern Zone and the airlift. There was a sense of anxiety in the country, a concern for those American people and the German people who were in West Berlin and having trouble getting food and supplies. But once again, it was not a large dominating issue as politics became later for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were old enough to understand who the enemy was and how dangerous they were.
Our school did not have Airraid Girls, but our neighborhoods did. Volunteers attend an Airraid boarding school, and I was 15 and I volunteered for that. I was the air raid warden for about an 8-block area and went to school and learned CPR and emergency measures.
Well, I guess the man I admired the most was Dwight Eisenhower. He, to me, was, I wouldn't say a father figure, but he was somebody I felt we could depend on because he was a very forthright kind of a person.
I would pick Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Even as a very young child, I had a tremendous admiration for him, for his wife, for what he was doing for the country, and the way he pulled us together in the war. I guess there has, post-Roosevelt's life, been some concern about his manipulation of that war, and I think Churchill's also. And I think they did make some mistakes. But as a child, or a young person, I had tremendous respect for him.
But generally speaking, everybody was pretty worried about the Cold War, and everybody was wondering, where is this all going to lead us to? And of course, the big worry was World War III.
My interest, I think, was the Berlin Wall. I found that a kind of a symbolic, I'm an artist, by the way, and so envisioning things is more powerful for me at many times than words are. And the image of that wall being built to shut some people in and to shut some people out was very, very powerful. And then as the stories came back to us about trying to escape through the sewers or jumping out of windows and trying to miss the barbed wire, that wall took on enormous significance about what a Cold War was about. Jerry and I had the opportunity to see the wall, and it was a very, very powerful time. We were there on the anniversary of the day that the wall began to be destroyed. It still brings tears to my eyes. We walked through Checkpoint Charlie and went into East Berlin. And 1 year after, the wall came down, and more than 50 years after the war ended, there was still rubble from that war in the streets. Had never been cleaned up. There was very little color. Everything was brown and gray and black. The buildings, the people's clothing, and very little light, very few even street lamps, compared to what we left in West Berlin, which was kind of like New York City. Tall, new buildings, a lot of traffic, excitement, color, and light everywhere. Neon lights, street lights.
I think the other thing was happiness and unhappiness.
Yes.
The people in the East Berlin were very unhappy. They all looked depressed, and they kind of matched their surroundings, the gray walls and the rubble and all that, whereas people on the West German side were active and busy and happy.
What had happened the day that the wall began to be torn down, they have a lot of large equipment that was working away at it. But people came up with hammers and shovels and picks and just literally physically got after that wall. And they broke it up into little tiny pieces, and they were everywhere. And I remember, just stepping over these things. And enterprising young people had begun to gather them up into little paper bags and selling them to tourists, to people like Jerry and me. So we bought a bag of the Berlin Wall and brought it back home. And Jerry made me little sculptures. We made one for every one of our 9 children. And he made a base for it, and I inserted a little piece of the wall, and we gave it to each of our kids. And we kept one for ourselves. So this is a piece of the Berlin Wall. It's captured between the 2 steel grids.
Well, now, after my space mission, in 1975, the State Department asked NASA if I could go behind the Iron Curtain and talk with the science people on the other side of the curtain. And so in '75, my first wife and I were flown to Hungary, to Budapest, and they were still occupied by the Russians. And we met with them. Then after that, we flew to Berlin and met with the people at the Academy of Science in East Berlin. So the Academy of Science at Hungary and in Berlin, and they were both occupied by Russians. And it was really an interesting thing to experience, because in both cases, the scientists would refer to the Russians as their visitors. And there was a third category of people in both of these places, and that was Hungarians and Germans who had decided to cooperate and collaborate with the Russians. And so the other Hungarians and Germans really hated them. They were considered to be traitors. And on more than one occasion, a Hungarian or an East German would make some snide remark about their visitors, but they were openly not rebellious, but openly angry with the people that had thrown in with the Russian and people. So it was an interesting experience for me. This was back in 1975. That's it's about 15 years before the wall came down. We tried to keep the discussions on science, so we didn't do much political speaking. And I think if any of the Hungarians had started talking political things, they would have been reported to the Russians and probably would have been punished for doing that. So it was quite an experience for me to go behind the wall and behind the Iron Curtain and talk with these people. But in Hungary, as well as in East Berlin, everybody was depressed.
What is one lesson that we should learn from the Cold War?
Well, I might get political here, but don't build walls. That's a terrible thing to do. We've learned that if you're unsure of somebody, don't trust somebody, you better find a way to communicate and overcome the lack of trust, because what it degenerates to is walls, and after walls it will be a war. And we don't need wars.
What was the first time you remember hearing about the Soviet Union and its conflict with the U.S.?
I think about the time that the Germans were getting ready to surrender in the latter part of World War II, because we considered the Russians to be an ally up until then. And it wasn't until Germany surrendered and we ended up carving up the country that we began to find that there was a lot of mistrust, and then we became more and more concerned about that. And that was the beginning for me anyway, of the Cold War.
I think something about the meeting at Yalta left me very uncomfortable. And I think it was, again, this image of carving up of three nations represented by three men who could say, I'll take this and I'll take that, and you can have this. I mean, it just seemed so impossible that we could treat our planet, our fragile home, that way.
When the Russians embarrassed us by getting Sputnik up there before we were even ready to do something like that, that was the beginning of the space race. After that, that we got into this race, and we would put up an astronaut and they would put up a cosmonaut, and then we'd do the same thing. And so we were just kind of trading back and forth, and nobody was thinking of space as a place for warfare. They were thinking of space more as a scientific or technology race between the two, a competition between the two countries. But As time went on, we began to have a little bit more antagonism amongst the two countries, political antagonism. But it was interesting when we started having international conventions and cosmonauts and astronauts were attending some of these conventions around the world. we found opportunities. The astronauts and cosmonauts found opportunities to get together. And the thing was, we were all just fighter pilots. And so we loved to fly and we loved to go into space and that sort of thing. And all this other political stuff didn't interest us at all. And so we ended up forming this organization called the Association of Space Explorers, in which the only requirement, the only thing you had to be able to have accomplished to be a member is you had to fly in space. And you had to do at least one orbit around the Earth in space. And so we had this very, very unique organization with very few people, but of course it's getting bigger and bigger now. We have quite a few hundred astronauts and cosmonauts that are members of it from all over the world. But we found that we could get along very nicely. We didn't have any problems at all. We at some of these conventions that we had with the space explorers, our wives had a chance to meet. We have two cosmonauts that were became very good friends of ours, and actually came to visit us in the United States when we lived in Arkansas, and we had a wonderful week together in Arkansas. And so the space program, from our point of view, was something that we really ought to cooperate on, we felt. And but there was not much we could do about the political situation. So one of the precepts of the Association of Space Explorers is that we wanted to foster a concern for the environment, because we could see from space the damage that the human beings were doing to our Earth down here. You could see all the pollution and that sort of thing. And that was a very strong concern of all the astronauts and cosmonauts. And the other concern was rescue. What would happen if some astronauts or cosmonauts were stranded in space and their country couldn't get any help to them soon enough? We were very concerned about the possibility that if it's possible for another country to do a rescue, that people be in a frame of mind to allow that to happen. So that was the two reasons for forming this Association of Space Explorers. That organization is still going on today. They meet every year or every other year in a different country, and basically discuss the same kinds of things, look at ways that we could cooperate. We send concerns to the United Nations.
My activism was in a couple of ways. First of all, my first husband was the football coach at Cornell. Cornell had its big crisis, like many of the colleges across the country did at that time, like Kent State. And at Cornell, it took the form of the black students taking over a building, eventually importing guns into the building and holding it for about 3 days, and in protest of the way that black students were treated on the campus. We had 5 black students on the football team. 3 of them went in the building and 2 of them stayed out. One who stayed out was the captain. And the 2 that stayed out were afraid for their lives. Because the black students had brought the guns in the building, the rumors were that people in the outlying districts of Ithaca, on the farms particularly where they had guns, were going to come in and have a shooting war with the blacks. So the 2 black students outside of the building were scared for their lives. And my husband and I sat up with these two kids all night long playing Monopoly to try to keep them calm and unafraid. And following that crisis, there was a lot of misunderstanding between about the way that the Cornell administration had negotiated with the blacks. A lot of people felt that they had sort of bowed over to them and had given them much more than they should have. And so my involvement at that point was to help Jack construct a communication with the parents of all of the football players to try to explain to them that many things. The guns didn't have bullets, so they had no intention of firing them. To the need for a new black student center and a need for changes in black admissions policies. So that was my physically active involvement. I mentioned earlier, I was an artist. I began a series of paintings that I called Continuum. That was my attempt to say that this was not uniquely American violence, but it was a violence that existed in all humans and had since the beginnings of evolution. That the issue was not condemning the incidents that were happening, but trying to find ways to resolve and change and come to understanding of our fellow man. So that was the other part of my social activism.